I think men in divorce tend to struggle more mentally than women.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I think that's
Why do you say that?
why is it that the men culture or society, because I know that a man's not going to go up to a guy and say, "Hey, my divorce is really sucking." But what do you want women to know about what men actually go through?
I mean, did it occur to you as a kid that they were experiencing grief?
No, but to tell you the truth, I was grieving and they didn't know I was grieving either.
To your point, there's the fear and there's the uncertainty and there's the grief, which you're still dealing with even in the best of divorces. Put on that growth mindset now, especially as a man, so that you're not repeating these mistakes in the future.
Welcome to the Just Separated podcast. Hi, I'm Karen Omand, a thanatologist, grief counselor, divorce strategist, and co-author of the Just Separated workbook. I draw on years of personal and professional experience to guide you through the challenges of your divorce. Together, with our expert guests, we'll equip you with the clarity, resilience, and tools to take charge and move forward with confidence. Follow Just Separated and join us as we explore the many different facets of divorce. Hi, welcome to the Just Separated podcast. I'm your host, Karen Omand, co-founder of Divorceworkshop. Today we're going to talk about why do we focus on the conflict between sexes in divorce, a male perspective, and our expert guest is JH Harper. JH is a divorce coach, writer, and award-winning journalist who works with men, often dads, around the world. He is trained in alternative conflict resolution, focusing on the future-facing process of communication and negotiation to achieve the best results for the entire family. He is based in New York City. Welcome, JH, to the Just Separated podcast.
Hi, Karen. How's it going today?
Good. So when you said, Karen, let's talk about this topic, I said this is a really good idea because divorce world can quickly turn into a battleground, and not just between the two people, but also between women and men. So why do you think that this divide happens so quickly? And what do you think is really underneath it all?
It's fascinating, right? Because I think there is always these sort of desire to, there's he said, she said, there's one against the other is the other, this othering within, marriage and divorce and separation is really problematic, right? So, and I see things like social media where there isn't sort of this middle ground, right? There's a need for attention. There's a need for sort of excitement, for things, some controversy. And in that is sort of that like the worst of all worlds. And I think it's really important, particularly in your real life relationship when, you're separating or getting divorced or co-parenting, this is a continuing relationship. You've embarked on some kind of relationship back in the day, and that doesn't just go away. And by sort of settling into this combative nature, right? These two different polar opposites where it's just a fighting arena is not in your best interest, right? And I think that's where we too often find ourselves. And in the real world, I don't think that's where you ideally want to be with your, former partner or your, co-parent.
Do you think it's easy to just go to the side that you fit with best? Like it's easy for just men against women and women, right? Like, do you think it's an easy thing that you just like women listen to women and then we feel, yeah, more powerful? Do you think there's that element?
I think it's really interesting. I think there's our digital lives and I think there's our sort of real physical lives. And what I find is that, in my world, I live in New York City and, I'm of that certain age where I know a lot of people who have separated or divorced. And what I've found is that those two opposite poles don't really exist, right? What I found is that within my greater friend and colleague group, like we don't choose sides. I have some friends that live right down the street and I have lunch with her and I have coffee with him, right? And that's not problematic. They're professionals, they're parents, they don't hate each other. My former partner is friends with them both as well. And I think I think that is not so unusual that in real life, no, we don't draw these distinctions of, I'm only friends with as a man, I'm only friends with the males. But I do think there is something about our digital lives where it draws people apart, right? Where people suddenly align themselves to one or the other. And along those lines of, yeah, you look on sort of the separation and divorce, on Instagram, and there's not a lot of, there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground, does there? It's all talks and narcissists and terrible things, and he said, and this bastard, and you know, which isn't really the language that I personally encounter in real life, and even with my clients. There's anger and there's frustration, but I don't see it such a line to this gender sort of warring, combative poles. Do you think that's true, Karen? Do you find that to be
Yeah.
true in your
Well,
life?
I'm curious to know if you can tell our listeners, what do you see generally with the men you work with that are like, what are the, like, with the women, they may have more emotion, more fear, um, a lot of, co-parenting issues, but what are the things that you see that men tend to worry about or
I
concerns?
It's interesting. I see, two sort of clients, and one of my clients is it's a very self-selecting group, right? It's that idea of, I talk a lot about giving yourself grace and dignity along this path, and also for your co-parent as well. I really do think this should be a collaborative process, ideally, right? And a lot of that is if you come to me, you might be a client, you might be a man who is like, listen, I don't want to fly off the handle. I want to be emotionally regulated. I want to. It's sometimes, I said, it's a little sad that you learn better communication methods after the fact, right? But it's figuring out these ways to communicate with that co-parent or former partner that are just better, taking out those triggering points, and lastly, just those negotiation ways where it's not necessarily a zero sum game, right? Where I'm not. It doesn't mean I lose and you win, or vice versa. It's that we can kind of figure out the commonalities where we can both get ideally what we want, right? So that is a client. I've got a really beautiful client who's been doing a lot of growth mindset work, who's really, he's gone to his own counseling. He is communicating very well with his co-parent, and they're really beautifully set up for a really, a happy divorce, if you will. And I do believe in this idea of a happy divorce. um, there's the other side of that client, which they're just frustrated, they're stuck, they are in a much more high conflict situation. um, but even then, the the results are the same, ideally, which is, listen, you're not going to change the other person, right? You what you can control is still the same thing that other client can control, which is how you deal with things, how you communicate, right? So the short part of that is, I think a lot of my clients are not calling their former partner bad names, or not full of invective and anger. Some anger, sure, but frustration. But they're not. They're coming to me because they see that there's a better future self, and to get there, there's some self work that needs to be done, right? The other side is that, yes, they're stuck and they are more aligned in that combative place. But for it to work, I think ideally you have to realize that it's not about the other person. It really comes back to how you're handling the stuff.
So why do you think men struggle or are not, their stories aren't told as much? Like the way I've heard you talk and the way I've even talked to others, um, men just we just don't hear about these stories, that how men are actually getting through divorce, right? Women, we know we're very much more social, we're out there. We can touch down about the domestic violence abuse after, but why is it that, like, that the men culture or society, because I know that a man's not going to go up to a guy and say, hey, my divorce is really sucking. They, like, it's just, is there a culture there with men that just doesn't, we know that, right? Like, it's just not talked about as much.
It's interesting, Kara. I think it depends, right? And I
Mm.
think there is, my father's generation is different than my generation. That is, I've got a 12-year-old son who's a different generation again, right? And sometimes I think there's sort of this gendered cliches, and then I think there is also there's a lot of guys have a hard time. I think generally, yeah, speaking about their emotions. A lot of men. I think that's a truism. I think that you know if you come from a family of men, I'm such a believer in one of the reasons I pursued this is I do believe modeling behavior is key, right? So if I can model for my 12-year-old son that it's okay to cry, that I have emotions, that sometimes I say, I messed that up. Listen, I screwed up today. I screwed up with you. My communication wasn't what I meant to be, and I'm sorry. What I've learned is that he can look at me and say, I love my dad. And yeah, he kind of maybe was a jerk yesterday. And he said he's sorry. And that's okay. Right. And it's okay to say you're sorry and I messed up. I don't think I ever heard that from my father. Right. And that modeling behavior, and it took me so many years to figure out how to just say I'm sorry, which is unfortunate. That's time that was wasted. Right. So that modeling behavior is so powerful. Now I'm a divorced man, and during my divorce, and I had again what I would call kind of a happy divorce. We didn't have a lot of conflict, but there were a lot of dark days. And I have two of my best friends three of my best friends I've known for 30 plus years, and several of them checked in on me daily. They were one of them sent me like a care box, and like they knew during the darkest days that they were there, right? And I did talk about my feelings and I did talk it through. And those gentlemen, I know I can rely on, and I'm helping one of them today through his own situations, and just having that, and again, that's that modeling behavior. And they have kids as well, and I hope that they actually have all daughters, as a matter of fact. And I really hope that they'll see their dads differently than probably my friends' dads, than they viewed their dads.
So basically, what we're trying to change, you're in the forefront of how you have your son. You're trying to change the way, because if you I was nodding my head when you're thinking about culturally, right? Like society with men, like I think of my grandfathers, like, wow, that they would never talk to feelings. Are you kidding? Right. But so what are the things that women need to understand about men that are going through divorce? Because there's a lot of information about how women, right? Women initiate divorce, lots of women divorce coaches, um, lots of support systems for women. But what do you want women to know about what men actually go through?
One thing is, I think you need to, nobody needs to do anything, but I think it's helpful to look at does this man have a support system, right? So I think it's a truism that many women have a better support system than the men do, right? Does this person have a best, do they, and this is also, I think, a bit of a cliche, but I think maybe some of the coasts are different than rural. I grew up in a really rural area. I grew up in like a farming community, and it looks different. The support system is a different kind of support system than you might find in a place like New York City. You might see the same people every day, but in a small town, people may not discuss things in the same way that you have a freedom in a big city. Oddly, like there's less judgment, there's less stigma. Karen, one thing I think interesting is, yeah, I've worked in the tech world for years as well. Everybody in the tech world has got laid off. It used to be if you got laid off, it was a terrible, terrible thing, right? You got laid off, it was a secret. Everybody I know has been laid off in the last 5 years one way. And there's no longer stigma. There's no longer embarrassment about getting laid off. It's just kind of the way the world works. And I think there's an interesting analogy to marriage there too, is like, listen, relationships are hard and sometimes they end. That isn't necessarily a failure, right? And being able to be able to reach out as a man and say like, hey, I'm struggling, going through this thing, does that man have the ability to reach out to a support system? And if they don't, then it's worth thinking about. Even if it is your former partner, you know, where can he find support system, people to talk to? It is that silent, being silent with your grief. It's a grieving process for all of us. And I think it's important. I guess this is my answer, actually. It's important to remember that the man is going through a grieving process just the same as a woman has. It does, because, you're giving up this vision of your future, right? We all go in not looking for a divorce or separate, and especially if you're a father or a mother, you have these beautiful ideas of what your family was going to look like. And when that's ended, that's sad, right? That's a grieving process. A lot of guys, I think, have a hard time showing that they're grieving, but they are. They absolutely are. And if they don't have an outlet of people to lean on, then I think that's when you worry. And I think that's often where we see some of the the overt anger or just frustration or the shutting down. Grief without an outlet piles on until it becomes these layers that are hard to reach.
Yeah, one of the things is that there is a lot of men do struggle with support systems, right? Like I know this in my grief world, right? It's like um when widows when their spouse dies, widows just tend to go to the support groups. They tend to go to meetings or join things. And men, not so much. I've done many support groups, and they'll if it's a table of 12, it's one guy and 11 women, right? So you're right. And I think it's also really important for women to know that if their ex has that support systems, they're going to fare better, which in turn they're going to divorce better and they're going to co-parent better, right?
100%, which is kind of why, it's interesting that I was like, oh, what I don't see within the divorce coach world is a lot of men who minister to men. There's an opening there for, like, if you don't have that support system, even if you do, the ability to talk through it, to have an ally, is really key. And I do think that women are just better at that, right? They're better at those support networks generally. And that's not all women and that's not all men, but I think there is a truism there. And, you know, having those allies, having that support network does make it better for everybody. And I think it's most especially true when you're a parent and, you want the best for your children, right? And so the more beautiful, happy of a divorce you can have, the better they will fare as well.
Do you find that we kind of touched on this, but that the drama on social media, the drama, high conflict divorces are the ones that feed us the most? Could that also, and I think as well, could be causing some of this divisiveness? I mean, adversarial between the men and women, as if, you know, you look at some of those high conflict divorces in the Hollywood or even in your state, New York, and it's like, everyone feeds off of it, right? Do you think people are, they go, oh, that person is like this, that's my ex, and then they start on that path, right? Meanwhile, what I want to say to that is that maybe your ex isn't high conflict, or maybe they're difficult in some ways, but maybe this is just how they're coping, like you said about how if they're isolated or that could be anger, because a lot of times anger underneath is deep hurt. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like, conflict is exciting, right? I mean, I'm a storyteller. I write, and you don't write about the good days. I mean, you always see things in newspapers that say, like, the good news today. There's a section that's that long, right? That is because, and yeah, because we naturally pay attention to the turmoil, the conflict. Unfortunately, I think, again, when we talk about our digital lives being somewhat different than our physical manifestations in our lives, so many people now go to support in the social, in social media, and again, go to Instagram and look at divorce, and you're not seeing a lot of middle ground there, are you? You're mostly seeing, again, I don't think before I really started in this world, I really ever saw the word narcissist. And narcissist is a clinical, it's a, you've got to go to somebody and that's a very real word with real consequences. We're just talking about selfish people essentially, right? But if you start looking on social media, you think that, like, there's a huge outpouring of actual narcissists, right? And you're like, yeah, I know some selfish people, but I don't know. I don't think I know anybody in my world that would actually qualify as a narcissist. But that's a buzzy word. It evokes a feeling, and then you're like, yeah, my damn ex-partner, they're a narcissist, and I think it's easy to start rolling with those feelings, particularly in social media, and that becomes sort of the path that you're following then, which is a much more combative path, right? So suddenly all you see is the negative divorces. Again, when we talk about modeling behavior on social media, that means that you may start channeling your mind and, like, well, maybe he did that on purpose, in I've done some, training and coaching. We talk about the iceberg assumption, which is, there's the iceberg. You see what people, you see the real world, and there's this whole underlying structure that you sort of assume that is why, these are the intentionality of is from what you can't see. But, this person is late because they don't care about me. maybe it's not because they don't care about you, they're not chronically late. Maybe it's because they are just absolutely overwhelmed with the new responsibilities, right? So the assumption that you've put on is they don't care, therefore they're late. Whereas maybe the reality is, listen, I'm late because I'm just overwhelmed with being a solo parent for the first time, et cetera, et cetera. All which leads back to, if you look on social media, you think, well, my former partner is an asshole, or she's terrible, or whatever, because that seems to be the running mantra, right? And I think it's important to take a step back and say, does this need to be that combative? Is this necessary? Is this really what my life looks like?
And it goes back to, when I was thinking when you're sitting there saying that is do you think many people understand what going through divorce is really like, right? Like, what do they really know unless they've been divorced before? Are they really prepared? And I'm going to tell you, no, they're not, because I have had clients that are not, and I was not. I had no idea. And I was from a divorced family. I had no idea. And I think that comes with stuff as well, right? So they're not really understanding the whole emotional gamut that happens with divorce. And so we all
When
kind
you
of jump.
when you said you were also like your parents were divorced. Did you know they were grieving? I mean, did it occur to you as a kid that they were experiencing grief?
No, but to tell you the truth, I was grieving and they didn't know I was grieving either. Right. So there's a whole bunch of really big wounds in there. Right. Whether they chose to leave, because the ones that left can also be grieving and, they may have done it before more so, but it's a huge, big grief process that no one really talks about, that the children are grieving, the parents are grieving, the emotions are high. You could be in fear and flight mode where you're hyper vigilant and you're attacky mode, but no one really understands this, right? And I think that's part of the problem. I don't know if you agree.
I hugely agree. I couldn't agree more. I think normalizing that grief, particularly when it comes to men, because we're less acknowledging of our emotions with that grief, right? And I think only in my own experience, I mean, I knew, like, there was this monumental losses of you know when your family structure changes, right? That means, and I think, fear is a product of uncertainty, but I also think the grief is different. I think we're fearful because we don't know what's going to look like, and I think that's natural. But I don't think we talk about that grief a lot. And I do think, and I know you've got deep experience, as a counselor in grief, right? So you know better than so many people. But I think, listen, you're giving up maybe half the time with your children. You're giving up, you may not think, a lot of things may have not worked, but you always had one great trip as a family. Now you're giving up this, you're giving up these familial structures, these friend structures. And even if they're not gone, they change. And that's hard, and I think that's hard. I think that's just hard for the men as is the women. And that's not a conflict thing. I think that is a grief thing.
Do you find that society, uh, what's the right word? When we're talking about that, a lot of men, not all, because I don't like to, it's just a general thing that they generally, not all, have to pay child support or spousal support. A lot of it on the women's side is like, yes, 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 yes. And that's valid. You do need to pay child support or whatever. Is there grief about that? About, or most men are just responsible with that because there's financial abuse and all that. But
Sure. I think that gets more to the combative side, right? That we would say that other F word is fair, right? And then, like, everybody's going to have some conflict about, you had conflict in money in your relationship, then you're certainly going to have it more so, right? So it comes to that fairness. And I think those are more likely to, in a man, hit that, like, combat, like the let's fight sort of instance. I will say, though, Karen, in my world, in so many of my clients, the male clients, like, they were not the one to initiate the marriage, and they're not necessarily the breadwinner, right? I mean, what I see a lot, again, I live in New York and I deal with a lot of coastal clients, is that, there's a lot of, these are high powered executive women who are, getting divorced, that do extremely well and have felt like they've had to carry their load, not only of the sometimes more child rearing than is fair, or household chores that are fair, but also have these, are very high powered, smart, competent, hugely amazing women, that actually just are making more money than the men. So what I also see on the other side is that the women sometimes are like, well, wait, I have to pay child support or some type of alimony, and there's sort of a shock there. And I think it also triggers that, like, wait, is that fair from the other side? And I think we're seeing more of that actually societally because, you know, some of the, I mean, partly it's because there's actually some more equality as far as sort of employment than there used to be. I mean, there's, a lot of the executives I deal with are women.
Hmm. No, it's good to hear the other side though, because as again, the narrative, right?
Is,
And
yeah,
that
that old
is
school.
the old school.
Don't you think? I think it's kind of wild. I think we tend to, divorce falls into these tropes, and they're really stereotypical tropes. What I've been finding in my last years working in this business is that it's a lot of stereotypes, a lot of gendered stereotypes. And I think that a lot of the nuance gets lost. And I think sort of that gendering stereotypes are really reinforced within, social media. Right. So, I mean, most of the women I know in my world are not housewives. They are badass women, and the men respect them. And even when things are going downhill, there's still a lot of love. There's still a lot of respect. There isn't a lot of like name calling. There's a lot of like, we want our children to be good and let's get there. Right. So, and to your point, there's the fear and there's the uncertainty and there's the grief, which you're still dealing with even in the best of divorces. But the meatier part of, the greater part of divorces fall into that like middle ground. We're disappointed, we're frustrated, it hasn't worked, we're grieving about that, but it isn't like, it's not somebody's throwing your clothes out the high rise window and we've all cheated on each other. I mean, that should happen certainly, but I don't think that is most people's experience.
Right, but as you as a journalist know that those stories don't sell.
Yeah, well, I mean, we want, I mean, it's funny. Just this week was like Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt mentioned something about like, it was, his divorce wasn't that big deal. And it hit like, I read that in 10 different places. Like, who cares? It's 10 years they've been, it doesn't make a difference. But, that sort of voyeuristic nature of like, oh, there's this beautiful, perfect couple that are absolutely not perfect, maybe makes us feel a little better, right? So it's worth reporting on that, it's a high conflict.
I do want to talk a little bit about the lawyers and the legal system because I'm wondering, and I've heard like there's billboards with lawyers. I'm not sure about New York, but I think this is in Florida, and it's like we will fight for you, and so that puts so we already are, some of us, when we're divorcing, in that fight or flight mode I talked about, right? We're fearful, we're uncertain, we're nervous. And then you see a board saying, we will fight for you. And even if your future ex husband or wife is pretty fair, they're a bit upset or whatever, but you're bought into that. I need, and I do you feel that the legal system, like the court system as well, and the some lawyers, not all, do set it up that way where it is kind of you against me, and that's how we get these big numbers of money we spend because we're getting that adversarial stuff going on?
I mean, I care 100%, right? I mean, I would say language matters. So yeah, the word fight, right away, that puts you it puts you on a path, right? So we will fight for you. That means that, yeah, we're talking about this is combative. This is a war. The negotiation is now a zero sum game where somebody wins and somebody loses. Right. So, yeah, I mean, again, we talk about those stereotypical tropes, all those. I mean, I don't watch much live TV anymore, but, those old school lawyer commercials where, the gavels banging and like, and then I think what happens is that there's this expectation that the courts are going to fix it for you. The lawyer's like, yeah, sure, we can do that. Well, absolutely, we can fight for that. Lawyer knowing full well that you're not going to win. But instead of saying, well, let's consider what does that look like? In fact, that even if there was adultery or something going on, that in fact, it's not the court's mandate to punish the other person for, infidelity or this, that, and the other. but I think it does. It plugs into, again, it's like a rom-com. Like you know what's going to happen to the end, right? Any of these, like these storytelling tropes. They're tropes for a reason because they're powerful. So if you feel injured and you see, that ad of like somebody's going to fight for you and they're going to punish, that punishing sort of language, it can carry you there. What I think is so important about sort of what we do as far as sort of coaching is like, let's look at the end game. Where do you want to be in 5 years, 2 years, even a year? And do you still want to be fighting? What have you given up? What have you destroyed along the way? What is the you know punishing behavior in the end? Is that going to accomplish where you want to be? Emotionally, financially, with your children. You know, it's will you guys ever be able to take a family vacation together or sit across each other at a graduation, or your child gets married? Are you going to not be able to sit on the same side of the aisle because you've gone through that fight? Or maybe we should all just bring down the tenor, bring down that tone a little bit now to look towards that a happier future. And I think it's
Yeah.
really important.
Yeah. I want to mention too, I don't know if anyone knows Perry Mason, but the legal in our age group we do, and I think there's a new Perry Mason on too on
There
one
is
of those
actually.
cable channel. But I just want everyone to know that in the family court system, there's never going to be a Perry Mason moment. No one wins in family court. I mean, it is a cookie cutter system, as you said, JH. They don't care if you had 10 affairs or one. It doesn't matter to them, and you will never get justice for that betrayal of that type of betrayal. I also want to touch down that we should mention domestic violence, domestic abuse. There are those cases that need to be, supported. We know that women are substantially more domestic abuse than men, but, and that being said, there are men that are in a domestic abuse situation, and it just isn't talked about, probably because of culture aspects. So I don't know what your thought on that is.
I mean, I think abuse situations are perpetrated by men, right? Unfortunately. So, and I think it's really important to, I think within our world as well, I think it's important to look out for those signs. Again, my clients tend to be sort of self-selecting. I think if you're a really abusive person, you're probably not going to come to a coach, or if you do, you need different kind of help, right? And if you are that angry and you get help, then I think I absolutely commend you. Like, get help. Like, that's an amazing thing, right? Um, and again, I don't. Yes, I think there are situations where there are high conflict people on both sides. I think it is, again, it's a trope that there aren't. And I mean, you hear situations where I think people just get so dug in on either side. I think that's much more common than probably a physical abuse from a woman to a man. But unfortunately, you look at it as situations where things are so out of hand that we're no longer talking about. You're no longer talking about easy solutions. You are talking about things that need to be, maybe the courts or the law enforcement do need to intercede there, right? So that's beyond the scope of the kind of things I normally deal with. But I'm always looking out for, telltale signs, and also, and emotional abuse even more prevalent. And also, when people pull kids into it, people are using their children as a fulcrum, between in a conflict. And I think that's much more common, on both sides of the gender equation.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because there is domestic abuse, there's post divorce abuse as well. And I just want to mention that there are two sides to it, right? So there are women that do abuse men. And I think not, we're not talking about percentages, right? Because I don't really have them on the top. I think 4-1 men and 3-1 women. So every third. Yeah. So it's 3-1, right? And 4-1 to men. So it is substantial to women more, but there is men that, maybe it's not physical, but maybe it's coercive control. Maybe it's the child thing that goes on. And I don't think that's talked about enough too, because it's either you're with us or you're
Or
with,
you're against, right?
you're against. And
Again, when we're talking about this modeling behavior, right, we're talking about sort of normalizing, again, like normalizing talking about your emotions, talking about why you're frustrated, getting at why you're angry, right? And the men who are isolated and frustrated and don't have outlets, right? So again, I think it's so important that it's okay to say I'm frustrated and I'm angry as a man, and then have somebody to talk to about it and figure out, what is causing those things. And we talk about like doing the work, but like doing the work matters, right? Figuring out how to be the best, potentially if you're a parent, be the best dad you can be, and making, to me, a divorce or a separation is a great time to sort of take stock and make those changes, right? This is, I would say it's like your birthday is your own holiday, and it's a good time to take stock. A separation or a divorce is a good time to say, like, what got me here and what can I change? Looking forward to some future away where you're going to have another romantic or, connection. Let me maybe not make these same communication mistakes. Let me get through this anger and frustration now and do that deep learning, you know put on that growth mindset now, especially as a man, so that you're not repeating these mistakes in the future. And again, modeling behavior for a child, if you have a child, that like, as a man, it's okay to cry. As a man, it's okay to say you're sorry. It's okay to say, hey, today's not working great for me, like, how are you? I'm great. No, actually, I'm struggling, and I think that's important to be able to say, hey, I'm struggling today. And I think that is hard for men to do.
And I think the thing that also is, I think men in divorce tend to struggle more mentally than women.
Do you think
And
so?
yeah, I think
Why do you say that?
I think that's researched because of isolation, because they don't get the support systems, and their identity to being married is just as important as a woman's identity to being married, right? And if you think, a lot of men, if they don't have those support system, who was their support system? It was their wife. And so they come home, and they don't have their kids there, and a lot of men worry about losing communication with their children. And if they're the ones that move out of the matrimony place first, and that sometimes happens, well, a lot of men worry about that communication with their kids, right? And so isolation, because women tend to just do that better. Men tend to fare off financially better. Women tend to fare off socially better. And we need to work on both, right? Men need to learn, as you've been trying to say, that get the support systems in place. Don't be isolated, right? And it's harder for men. I think there's a shame there. I know as a woman we feel shame too, but men,
It's different.
they don't. It's a different, and they don't talk about it, right? Um,
Unfortunately, the old school thing is like I've got it all control. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to learn. Right? It's the opposite of growth mindset. Right? And admitting failure is a failure. There's a lot of thinking these days that and I totally agree with it. You need to fail. If you're not pushing something to failure, then you're not really learning. Right? And I think, unfortunately, I've seen this my whole life, that a lot of guys at 24, they stop trying new things. They stop learning because, they take a job and whatever, but then, they don't want to look silly. They don't want to look like they don't know. So rather than saying, I don't know, or I need help, they just start avoiding things. Right. And I think that's emotional too. And that's really unfortunate. Right. A divorce is a great time to re-kickstart that growth engine, that growth mindset, to say, man, this didn't work out, right? This mentality maybe was not serving me. And this is high performing men. These are men that are, I deal with a lot of sort of titans of business that outwardly are kicking ass. And there's also that fear of failure, looking, oh yeah, my wife left me because I can't communicate, or whatever. And one of the things I work with my clients is a lot of these guys are, outwardly super successful, but figuring out to say, hey, this is something I need to work on, this communication. Or, I may be in the boardroom and I negotiate tooth and nail, but that might not serve me in this case. It might hurt my kid, and my co-parent is not a terrible person. Maybe we should work together in a more of an interest-based a negotiation process versus a positional process, which is like, I win, you lose. I'm gonna, one of us is gonna an alimony 10,000 a month or else, or whatever, and that doesn't really serve anybody.
Yeah, the win-lose mentality doesn't work in divorce because there's really, when you go through divorce, it's really lose-lose. It's just do it fair, like do as best as you can, because you are dividing everything up. Money's emotional, grief's emotional, divorce is emotional. It is just trying to get through a legal contract, and if just we know this because we've been through it, right? And that's why we can say it here. It's just that when they're going through it at the beginning, there's so much emotion, it gets overwhelmed, right? We often say divorce is 95% emotional and 5% legal. Like it is. Because it's a loss, and I often say it's a death of a relationship, and it's huge because it's also with your children, right? And
It's a death of self. It's death of who you self-identified as, right? And I really do believe, Karen, there is a happy thing as a happy divorce, right? If you guys are not so far apart from each other that you can still find those places to collaborate and make it more collaborative, and realize that, like, hey, again, look, grace and dignity just go a really long way, and when you change your own approach, I think it can open up. You could say, I'm sorry and I'm listening, especially as a guy, that goes a long way. I understand. I hear where you're coming from. I'm sorry I did that. Yes, I can work with you on that. And that may not mean giving up 70% of something, but it may mean looking for this Venn diagram of things where actually, like, I'm happy to give you this, and you're happy, you may not be so aligned with that, and we may be able to, work together in a much more collaborative nature. And I think it's more doable than a lot of people, certainly more doable than we see on social media, where it's
yeah,
again, it's the
and
hammering.
I think the lawyer, like the court system and some of the lawyers and stuff, we
I
need
love
to
being a
this.
mediator. I mean, a mediation has got to be one of the best things in the world. I mean, I had an amazing mediator. I work with some great mediators, and it's God's work, right? It's such a beautiful process when you get somebody who's really able to work with you, and you can keep it out of that. You can keep it out of that just combative system as much as possible.
Yeah, and we're not saying it's a cakewalk, right? We're not. There's
No, it
no.
sucks.
It sucks. So we just want everyone to be prepared. Like it is not a. This is not an easy journey, but you can get through it. So before we wrap up and I ask the last question, is there anything that we left out today?
I don't think so. I really do think that I think we really touched on something I think is important, and that is the man in your life, your former partner, is grieving too. He's absolutely grieving what was, what could have been, what he had envisioned, that family life, whether he's able to, like, say it in a really outward way. I think it's important to realize that, and hopefully he can learn to give his former partner grace, and a little grace on the way back can also help.
Yeah, that's important just to note. So grief can show up as anger, right? And so
Oh,
if they're
sadly,
angry and they're not this narcissist crazy person that you're married to, have, as you said, have grace, because grief definitely can show up as anger.
we're
It's
not
one.
giving anybody a buy, right? We're not saying
Mm,
it's that anger is not okay. I don't think anger is ever okay, but it helps to realize sometimes that it's not coming from the place you always assume it is.
yeah,
Sometimes it's just coming from that grief and hurt.
yeah. So that I asked this question for everybody on the podcast. So for someone who's just separated, whether they left or were left, what advice would you give them to help them navigate those overwhelming early days?
I think it's that support system. I mean, I don't think that's novel. I think that if you are, I think often, right, we've given up our best friends over the relationships. We have our kids. You you lose that support system, and I will say, particularly for a man, I think that making that first call to an old friend, maybe a family member, and saying, "I'm struggling. Here's what's going on, and I'm struggling." I think there is real power in that, and that support system, and just being able to be a little emotionally vulnerable to Maybe this isn't somebody you've talked to a lot, but somebody who still cares about you. Could be a brother or sister, whomever, could be still your parents. And making that first call and saying, I'm struggling, I'm grieving, I'm angry, I'm frustrated, whatever, is that first step to creating that support system, which you're going to need, not just through the divorce, but through all the rest of that as well. The post-divorce, through all those, those dark days when you are alone and your children are at your co-parent's house, and it just seems sad and lonely, that it's okay to say you're struggling and you need some help. And that is part of the growth mindset.
That's great. So whereabouts do they get your website? And you do one-on-one coaching, I think, all over the world, correct?
Yeah, I do. I work with high impact individuals all around the world. Divorce Coach Men's is the actual website, and it's a divorce transition coaching for men. I do work with some women as well, but a lot of my clients are dads, right? So you can find me on Instagram, and reach out. We do obviously a 30-minute gratis consultation, and sometimes you'll just find that having an ally through these things makes everybody's life better.
Yeah. I think this is a really important conversation. I think we need to start talking about this more. So I appreciate you coming on and helping us open up the pathways for people to understand. It doesn't have to be such a one-sided story. If we can kind of look at both as with compassion, and also have self-compassion on ourselves. So I really appreciate you coming on, JH.
Thanks, Karen. I really enjoy it. Let's blow up those stereotypes, right? And make it happier for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for joining today's discussion with our divorce expert. Check out the show notes for more about our guest. If you're finding value in our podcast, follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and our YouTube channel at Divorce Workshop. Share your questions, comments, or guest suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. For a comprehensive divorce guide, check out our Just Separated workbook on Amazon worldwide. This workbook covers everything from emotions and co-parenting to finances, legal insights, and recovery, a must-have for anyone navigating separation or divorce.